The scent of aged paper and decaying leather was the only perfume Elara Vance had ever known. At 22, she lived her life between the fragile pages of history, her small, careful hands mending the spines of books that had outlived empires. In the hushed sanctuary of Vance & Sons booksellers, a century-old establishment gasping its last breaths in a quiet corner of Boston, she was more archivist than woman. Each morning, the low, amber light, filtering through the tall, dusty windows, would find her already at her workbench, a solitary figure lost in a world of forgotten words. She treated each brittle page with a reverence she could never afford her own soul, carefully reinforcing its structure while her own was silently beginning to fray. Her existence was a quiet, dutiful whisper, a life lived in the margins of other people's stories, and the silence of the bookstore was a perfect echo of the vast, hollow space within her own heart. If you want to discover what force is about to shatter her fragile peace, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. We continue. Vance & Sons Booksellers wasn't just a store, it was a mausoleum of dreams, a cathedral of silence where time seemed to have paused. The towering shelves, crammed with volumes from floor to ceiling, stood like ancient sentinels guarding forgotten tales. Elara knew the soul of this place because it was her own. She had grown up in its shadows, learning the weight of history before she learned the lightness of a first kiss. But a modern, aggressive cancer was eating away at its foundations. Debt. A debt that grew with every unanswered bill, every final notice. A relentless tide of red ink, threatening to wash away the last bastion of her family's legacy, and the only world she had ever truly inhabited. The Sons, in the faded gold leaf sign above the door, was a cruel, lingering irony. There was only her, a daughter, left to stand against the tide. Her father, the last of the Vance men, to curate this collection, was now a ghost, haunting the upper rooms of their small apartment above the shop. A debilitating illness had stolen his strength, his voice, and his spirit, leaving behind a frail man who looked at his life's work with vacant, heartbroken eyes. Elara's mission was therefore twofold: to preserve the books from the ravages of time, and to preserve her father from the crushing reality of their failure. Every day was a performance of quiet competence, a brave face held up to mask the panic that clawed at her throat in the dead of night, a desperate attempt to protect him from the truth she carried alone. At her age, other young women were navigating the chaotic, vibrant worlds of love and ambition. They were making mistakes, falling in and out of relationships, discovering themselves in the exhilarating mess of life. Elara, however, was a relic herself, as untouched and carefully preserved as the first-edition classics she kept under glass. Her virginity was not a statement of moral principle or a conscious choice, but a fortress built of responsibility and a deep-seated shyness that had calcified into an impenetrable wall. She had never had the time, the energy, or the emotional freedom to let someone in. The very idea of intimacy felt like a language she couldn't speak, a world she could only read about, forever sealed off from her own reality. She was a caretaker of legacies, not a creator of her own. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the evening, when the city outside had fallen into a muted hum, she would allow herself a moment of transgression. While restoring a weathered copy of a romantic novel or a book of passionate poetry, her gloved fingers would trace a line of verse describing a stolen glance, a feverish touch, a love that defied all reason. A faint, unfamiliar heat would rise in her cheeks, a forbidden ache blooming deep within her chest. It was a fleeting, secret indulgence, a glimpse into a life she was certain she would never lead. The fantasy would last only a moment before guilt washed over her, cold and sharp, for daring to want something for herself when her family's entire history was crumbling in her hands. She would then work with renewed, almost punishing, focus. Her profession was a perfect, painful mirror of her existence. Day after day, she would take something broken, a torn page, a detached cover, a faded inscription, and pour all of her patience and skill into making it whole again. She was a restorer, a mender of things that others had deemed lost. It was a meticulous, solitary craft that required absolute control and a steady hand, qualities she desperately tried to apply to her own life. Yet, she could feel the cracks forming within herself, the fine, hairline fractures of exhaustion and loneliness spreading through her spirit. She feared that, unlike the books she so lovingly saved, there would be no one to mend her when she finally fell apart. No one to stop her from disintegrating into the same fine dust she so carefully brushed from their covers. The illusion of timelessness was shattered on a Tuesday morning by a single, sterile envelope. It arrived not by the gentle hand of the old mailman, but by a courier, its sharp, modern edges, a stark violation of the soft, worn world of the bookstore. It lay on the dark, polished wood of the front counter, a stark white rectangle of impending doom. Ilara stared at it, her breath hitched in her throat. She didn't need to open it to know what it was. It was the final notice, the official end. Her fingers, usually so steady, trembled as she picked it up. The embossed letterhead was cold and impersonal, bearing a name that felt like a threat. Thorn Acquisitions. It was a name that promised not restoration but demolition. A name that signaled the arrival of a world that had no place for history, or for her. The world outside Vance & Sons was a city in constant, aggressive motion. Boston's historic district was a battleground where cobblestone streets fought a losing war against encroaching glass and steel. From her window, Ilara could see the reflections of modern life warped in the antique glass, hurried figures with cell phones pressed to their ears, the sleek, silent glide of expensive cars, the vibrant pulse of a world that had no memory of the past she so carefully curated. The bookstore was an island, a temporal anomaly adrift in a relentless current of progress. The barrier between her world and theirs was more than just glass and brick. It was a chasm of experience, of ambition, of life itself. The sounds of the city, sirens, laughter, the distant roar of traffic, were a foreign language, a constant reminder of her own profound and suffocating silence. Inside, the oppression was more intimate, woven into the very fabric of the building. It was in the faint, sweet smell of mold creeping up from the basement, a scent of slow, inevitable decay that no amount of polish could erase. It was in the stack of final notices she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her workshop, their sharp-cornered certainty, a stark contrast to the soft, worn edges of her books. Each letter was a paper tombstone marking another failed month, another step closer to the abyss. This secret financial rot was a physical weight on her shoulders, making her stoop like an old woman, her youth eroded not by years but by the ceaseless, grinding anxiety of impending ruin. She moved through the aisles with a forced lightness, terrified that even her footfalls might be heavy enough to bring the whole fragile structure crashing down around her. Her father's room was the heart of this oppressive stillness. Arthur Vance, once a man whose voice could fill the cavernous bookstore with tales of literary giants, was now a specter in his own home. He sat propped against a mountain of pillows, his gaze fixed on a patch of peeling wallpaper, his large, scholarly hands lying limp on the worn quilt. Ilara's day was structured around his needs, the careful preparation of his meals which he barely touched, the gentle turning of his frail body to prevent sores, the hours she spent reading aloud to him from his favorite poets, her voice a soft, steady murmur in the silent room. She never knew if he heard her, if the words registered in the fog of his mind, but she continued the ritual faithfully. His silence was a constant, screaming accusation of her failure, a testament to a legacy she was letting slip through her fingers. The ghost of her mother, Eleanor, was a more subtle yet equally powerful presence. Her portrait hung in the small hallway, her expression a study in gentle disappointment. Eleanor had been a pragmatist, a woman who understood numbers better than narratives. She had loved the bookstore for Arthur's sake, but she had always warned of its impracticality in a changing world. "Sentiment doesn't pay the bills, Ilara." Her voice would echo in Ilara's memory, a cold dose of reason against her own romantic devotion. It was Eleanor who had instilled in her a rigid sense of duty, a belief that a woman's worth was measured in her sacrifices and her quiet endurance. Now Ilara felt her mother's painted eyes following her, judging her inability to reconcile the poetic world of her father with the harsh prose of financial reality. She was failing them both. The community, what little of it remained from the old days, offered a kindness that felt like a slow-acting poison. Mrs. Gable from the Italian bakery across the street would bring over day-old cannoli with a sad, knowing look. Mr. Chen, who ran the laundromat, would quietly refuse payment when she brought in her father's linens, patting her hand with a gesture that was meant to be comforting, but felt like a brand of pity. Their well-meaning charity underscored her family's fall from grace. The Vances had once been pillars of this community, respected scholars and merchants. Now, Elara was the neighborhood tragedy, the poor, dutiful daughter chained to a dying father and a dying business. Every sympathetic smile, every offered kindness, was another bar in the cage of her public humiliation, forcing her to retreat further into the shadows of the store. Her routine was a monastic vow of self-denial. It began before the sun rose, the cold floorboards a shock to her bare feet as she moved to check on her father. The day was a blur of meticulous, unpaid labor, dusting shelves that no customers browsed, cataloging inventory that would never sell, and spending hours hunched over her workbench, her fine-tipped tools performing miracles on decaying paper, while her own life decayed around her. Lunch was often a piece of toast eaten standing up, her eyes scanning the street for the mail carrier, dreading his arrival. Evenings brought no respite, only the transition from the store's needs to her father's. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and dreamless, a brief cessation of anxiety before the cycle began anew. There was no space in this life for a moment of spontaneity, for a friend's call, for the simple, selfish act of being young. Through the large front window she witnessed life as a spectator. She saw couples strolling by, their hands intertwined, their laughter a bright, piercing sound that seemed to mock the funereal quiet of her store. She saw groups of students from the nearby university, their faces alight with debate and possibility, their backpacks filled with futures she couldn't imagine. A particular young woman, who worked at the modern art gallery down the street, often passed by. Her vibrant clothes and confident stride a painful counterpoint to Alara's own muted existence. Elara didn't feel jealousy so much as a profound sense of disconnection, as if she were a black-and-white photograph observing a world that had burst into vivid, dynamic color without her. She was an archivist of life, not a participant in it. This self-imposed exile was fortified by a deep-seated morality, the last inheritance she truly possessed. The Vance name stood for integrity, for the belief that some things, knowledge, history, honor, were above commerce. She clung to this ideal with a fierce, almost desperate grip. The thought of compromising, of seeking an easy solution or a handout that would tarnish that legacy, was abhorrent to her. She believed that her struggle was a noble one, that her sacrifice had meaning. This conviction was both her shield and her heaviest shackle. It prevented her from seeing any way out that did not involve her own quiet, dignified self-destruction. To her, selling the store to a developer would be no different than burning the books herself. It was a betrayal of her entire lineage. The greatest strain was the performance. For her father, she had to be a beacon of hope, a purveyor of comforting fictions. She would invent stories of enthusiastic customers, of rare books sold for a handsome profit, her voice steady and cheerful as the lies left her lips. "Mr. Abernathy was in today," she'd say, describing a long-dead patron. "He was so pleased we still had that first edition of Whitman." She would then read the glowing, fabricated sales figures from a ledger she kept purely for this purpose. This constant deception was exhausting, a corrosive acid eating away at her soul. She was not only a caretaker and a restorer, but also an actress in a tragic play with an audience of one, a play where she had to pretend the crumbling set around them was still a magnificent castle. And so, the letter from Thorn Acquisitions became the focal point of all this pressure. It lay on her workbench, a stark white blade threatening to sever the last thread of her endurance. It represented the failure of her performance, the collapse of her moral fortress, and the end of the world she had sacrificed everything to protect. The name, Thorn, felt sharp and violent, a perfect symbol for the brutal, uncaring force that was about to rip through her life. Holding it, Elara felt the full weight of her entrapment. The walls of the bookstore, once a sanctuary, now felt like the cold, hard sides of a tomb. There was no more room to retreat, no more comforting fictions to invent. She was cornered, and for the first time, a terrifying, forbidden thought began to form. Perhaps survival would require her to become someone she didn't recognize. The name Julian Thorne was a whisper of dread in Boston's preservation societies, and a roar of triumph on the stock exchange floor. Known as the architect of ruin. He didn't just build, he erased. His office was a sterile sanctuary on the 70th floor of the city's tallest glass tower, a minimalist expanse of chrome and black leather that offered a panoramic, godlike view of the world he was systematically conquering. He moved through this space with a predatory grace, his tailored suits a form of armor against a world he viewed with cold, transactional disdain. Power was his language, and his silence was more potent than most men's threats. He was a monument to self-creation, a man who had clawed his way from an unspoken, brutal past to a present where he could demolish any history, including, he hoped, his own. Beneath the veneer of ruthless efficiency, Julian was a man in exile from his own humanity. His past was not just a memory, but a phantom limb that ached with the betrayals that had shaped him. He had learned early that love was a currency used for extortion, and vulnerability was a fatal flaw. This cynical conviction was the engine of his ambition. By transforming the sentimental, historic corners of the world into cold, hard assets, he was proving his central thesis. Everything and everyone had a price. As he reviewed the file for Vance & Sons booksellers, it was nothing more than another acquisition. Another red line on a balance sheet. The faded photograph of the quaint storefront represented a weakness he had long since purged from himself, a foolish attachment to things that could not be quantified or controlled. Driven by a desperation that felt like a physical illness, Alara made the decision to face him. It was a pilgrimage of the damned, trading the soft, dusty light of her world for the harsh, unforgiving glare of his. She took the subway, the screeching of the train's wheels, a soundtrack to her own frantic thoughts, each stop taking her further from the familiar cobblestones and deeper into the city's heart of steel. The Thorn Tower loomed over the street, a shard of glass aimed at the sky, so tall it seemed to sever the clouds. Walking towards its entrance, clutching the worn leather strap of her satchel, she felt like a character from one of her books, stepping out of the narrative and into a world where her kind of magic, the magic of history and heart, had no power. She was a page of parchment about to be fed into a shredder. The lobby of Thorn Acquisitions was designed to intimidate. It was a cavern of polished marble and cold air, so vast and silent that the sound of her sensible shoes echoed like gunshots. A severe-looking woman sat behind a monolithic black desk, her expression as unyielding as the stone around her. Ilara felt her own substance begin to thin, her presence shrinking under the weight of so much calculated, impersonal wealth. She was an anachronism, a relic of a forgotten time, her simple wool coat and earnest anxiety, a stark, pathetic contrast to the sleek, emotionless power that radiated from every surface. When she gave her name, the receptionist's gaze flickered over her with a dismissal so complete it was almost an act of violence. This place wasn't just a building. It was a fortress, and she had come to petition its king. She was led not into a boardroom but into his private office, a space that felt less like a place of work and more like a viewing platform for the end of the world. The city spread out below them, a miniature silent kingdom. Julian Thorn was not behind his desk. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to her, a dark, motionless silhouette against the blinding sky. When he turned, the movement was slow, deliberate. He was younger than she expected, his features sharp and unforgivingly handsome, his dark hair impeccably styled. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a winter storm, and as they swept over her, she felt a profound, invasive chill, as if he were not merely looking at her, but performing a clinical dissection, cataloging her weaknesses and valuing her worth. He did not invite her to sit. He remained standing, a subtle but effective assertion of dominance. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, resonant baritone that seemed to absorb all the sound in the room. "Miss Vance, I've reviewed your file. The debt is substantial. The property's value is in the land, not the structure. My offer is final and, frankly, generous." Each word was a perfectly polished stone, dropped into the silence, devoid of sympathy or negotiation. He spoke of her home, her life's work, her entire world, as if it were a simple commodity, a line item on a spreadsheet he had already closed. He was the physical manifestation of the sterile envelope that had shattered her life, a man made of the same cold, sharp-edged paper, and he was utterly unmoved by the history he was about to destroy. For a moment all the air left Alara's lungs, but then, An image of her father's vacant eyes filled her mind, and a fierce, protective anger surged through her, burning away the fear. She took a step forward, her voice trembling but clear. "It's not just a structure, Mr. Thorne. It's 100 years of my family's history. It's a sanctuary for words that have outlived their authors, for ideas that have shaped this city. You see a plot of land, but I see a soul." She spoke not of finances or legalities, but of the intangible things he had dedicated his life to eradicating. Her plea was not for pity but for recognition, an appeal from one world to another, a desperate attempt to make him see the life teeming beneath the surface of his cold, hard numbers. Julian's expression remained impassive, but something shifted in his gaze. He was accustomed to the predictable theatrics of desperation, tears, rage, hollow threats. He was not prepared for this. He was not prepared for the quiet, unyielding dignity in her stance, the raw, unfiltered passion in her voice that spoke of a conviction he had long ago dismissed as a childish fantasy. He found himself studying the way her hands were clenched at her sides, the fierce light in her wide, honest eyes. She was not a business problem. She was a philosophical one. An artifact from a world he had meticulously demolished within himself. This unexpected encounter with such genuine, unbuyable belief was like finding a wildflower pushing its way through a concrete sidewalk, illogical, fragile, and utterly captivating. The purpose of the meeting was concluded. His decision was unchanged. The bookstore would fall. Yet the air between them remained thick and charged, humming with an energy that had nothing to do with real estate. His professional mask was still in place, but behind it a dormant curiosity was stirring. He saw the defiant pulse beating in the delicate skin of her throat and felt a strange, unwelcome pull. For Ilara, his sustained, analytical silence was more unnerving than his initial dismissal. It felt as though he was seeing through her clothes, through her skin, directly into the frightened, fiercely beating heart of her. It was a terrifying, invasive intimacy that was both a violation and, to her shame, a spark of something dangerously like fascination. She felt seen by him in a way no one ever had. With a final, clipped sentence he broke the spell. "The market has made its decision, Miss Vance. I am merely its instrument." He turned back to the window, a clear and brutal dismissal. The audience was over. As Ilara walked out of the office on unsteady legs, the weight of her failure pressing down on her, she carried with her the unsettling memory of his gaze. She had lost the battle for her home, but an entirely different, more perilous conflict had just begun. Julian Thorne remained at the window long after she was gone, his reflection a stern mask in the glass. He stared down at the city, but for the first time in years he wasn't seeing the future he planned to build. He was seeing the face of a woman who represented a past he could not simply demolish. The days that followed were a haunting. Ilara moved through the familiar, hallowed silence of the bookstore. But it was no longer a sanctuary. It was now a space imprinted with his memory. The air where he had stood seemed to hold a residual charge, a ghost of his expensive, clean scent that was an assault on the comforting musk of old paper and leather binding. She would find herself staring at the spot on the floor where he had turned, the cold assessment in his eyes more vivid than the words on any page before her. He had seen her desperation, her fragility, and had not flinched. This clinical observation was a new kind of violation, one that left her feeling exposed and strangely, shamefully, alive. She was no longer just the dutiful daughter. She was an object of a powerful man's analytical gaze, and the thought was a constant, unnerving hum beneath her skin. Back in his glass tower, Julian Thorne found his legendary focus fractured. He was a man who dealt in absolutes, in data points and profit margins. Yet Ilara Vance was an infuriating, unsolvable variable. Her file lay on his desk, a thin collection of papers that told him nothing of the fire he had seen in her eyes or the tremor of conviction in her voice. He tried to dismiss her as a sentimental fool, an irrelevant relic standing in the way of progress, but the image of her, small and defiant in his cavernous office, returned to him at unwelcome moments, during a hostile board meeting, while reviewing architectural plans in the dead of night. She was an anomaly, a piece of a world he had sworn to himself no longer existed, and her authenticity was a quiet, maddening challenge to the very foundations of his cynical empire. He came to the bookstore a week later. The sleek black car he arrived in, a silent, predatory beast parked at the curb. The pretense was a final structural assessment, a formality before demolition, but they both knew it was a lie. He moved through the narrow aisles with a contained energy that seemed to suck all the air from the space, his polished shoes silent on the creaking floorboards her family had walked for a century. Ilara watched him from her workbench, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He was an invader, his modern, tailored suit, a stark and brutal contrast to the soft, decaying beauty of her world. His presence here was a deliberate act of psychological warfare, a reminder that he owned this space now, and by extension he owned her. She felt a primal urge to protect her books from his very gaze. She stood to meet him, her body forming a fragile barricade between him and the heart of the store. "The assessment isn't necessary," she said, her voice betraying a slight tremble she despised. "The structure is sound." Julian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached out and ran a single gloved finger along the gilded spine of a leather-bound volume of poetry. The gesture was slow, possessive, and unbearably intimate. It was as if he were caressing her own skin. "I'm not here for the structure, Miss Vance," he murmured, his stormy eyes finally lifting to meet hers. "I'm here to understand the value of the contents." The ambiguity in his words hung in the air between them, thick and dangerous, making it clear he was not talking about the books, but about the conviction that bound her to them. For a long, charged moment they stood in silence, the only sound the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. He was testing her, she knew, pushing at the edges of her composure to see where she would break. He saw the defiant tilt of her chin, the fierce loyalty that burned in her eyes, and it did not move him to pity, but to a cold, calculating curiosity. He was a collector of rare things, and he was beginning to realize that her spirit, her unyielding, anachronistic sense of honor, was the rarest commodity he had ever encountered. He wanted to see what it would take to acquire it, to own it, to see it finally bend to his will. This was no longer a simple real estate transaction. It had become a personal, high-stakes acquisition. Ilara felt his intention like a physical pressure, a force that sought to pin her to the wall. The air crackled with the unspoken conflict, a battle of wills being waged in the charged space between their bodies. It was in this moment that her own internal war intensified. A part of her, the dutiful daughter, the guardian of the Vance legacy, was filled with a pure, righteous hatred for this man who saw everything she held sacred as a commodity. But another, deeper, more treacherous part of her was captivated. She had spent her life in the company of ghosts and fading words. His raw, vital, and dangerous presence was like a lightning strike in her muted world. The fear he inspired was inextricably tangled with a terrifying, forbidden thrill that made her feel, for the first time, intensely and dangerously real. His visits became a pattern of subtle torment. He would appear unannounced, sometimes under the guise of speaking with his legal team on the phone just outside her window, his deep voice a deliberate intrusion into her quiet. On another occasion, she saw him across the street, sitting in a small cafe, watching her through the glass as she went about her duties. He was a hunter, studying his prey, learning her habits, her routines, her solitude. Each sighting was a small, calculated act designed to unnerve her, to keep her constantly aware of his presence and his power. He was dismantling her piece by piece, ensuring she understood that there was no corner of her life he could not reach, no sanctuary he would not violate. The bookstore was no longer her refuge. It had become the cage where he observed her. During one of these encounters, he crossed the street from the cafe and entered the store just as she was preparing to close. The evening light cast long shadows, making the space feel more intimate, more confined. "You worked too hard for something that is already lost," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. The cruelty was casual, almost bored. Ilara didn't look up from the cash drawer she was closing. "Some things are worth fighting for, even if the fight is lost," she replied, her voice low. He moved closer, his shadow falling over her. "There is no nobility in martyrdom, Miss Vance, only foolishness." His proximity was overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating from his body and smell the faint, clean scent of his skin beneath the expensive cologne. Her control finally snapped. She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a fury born of exhaustion and despair. And what would you know of nobility? You, who only knows how to tear things down, you see this place as a failure, a financial liability. But it was built on love and knowledge, things your balance sheets can't measure. It has a soul. The words poured out of her, raw and unfiltered. For the first time, she wasn't pleading. She was accusing. She was holding up the values of her world as a mirror to the emptiness of his, and the act of defiance felt like a desperate, exhilarating gasp of air after being held under water for too long. She had finally shown him her teeth, and she braced herself for his final, crushing blow. Julian's reaction was not what she expected. There was no anger, no cold dismissal. Instead, a flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes, a shadow of pain so fleeting she thought she might have imagined it. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for a split second, the mask of the ruthless magnate slipped, revealing a glimpse of a man who understood loss more deeply than she could ever know. He had also fought for something once, and lost. The moment of shared, unspoken humanity was so intense, so disorienting, that it felt more intimate than a touch. He quickly rebuilt his walls, his expression hardening back into its familiar impassivity. But the crack had been revealed. He was not a monster made of stone. He was a man who had encased his own broken heart in it. This brief, accidental glimpse into his soul was more dangerous than all his calculated cruelties. It reframed her fear into something far more complex and treacherous, a nascent, unwilling empathy. Her hatred, once a clean and righteous fire, was now muddied with confusion. The man who was her family's destroyer was also a man who carried a profound wound. This realization terrified her, because it made him human. It made the pull she felt toward him not just a shameful physical attraction to a powerful enemy, but a deeper, more perilous connection to a fellow broken soul. The dilemma was no longer a simple choice between her duty and his demands. It was now a battle within herself, between her own moral code and the forbidden, burgeoning desire to understand the man who was intent on her ruin. Julian, too, was unsettled by the encounter. Her accusation that he only knew how to tear things down had struck a nerve he thought long dead. He had spent his entire adult life constructing an empire as an act of defiance against a past of brutal powerlessness. He built skyscrapers to erase the memory of the hovel he grew up in. He wielded financial power to forget the feeling of being utterly disposable. But this woman, with her fierce defense of a dusty, worthless shop, had unknowingly pointed to the hollow core of his success. He could acquire anything, but he could create nothing of real, lasting meaning. He left her store that night with a disquieting sense of dissatisfaction, the victory he was so close to achieving suddenly feeling bitter and empty. The following days were a torment of indecision for Ilara. The final eviction date loomed, a guillotine hanging over her life. The pressure from the bank was relentless, and her father's health seemed to decline with each passing day, as if he could sense the impending end. Her moral fortress was crumbling, eroded by financial desperation on one side, and her own confusing, unwanted desires on the other. She would lie awake at night, the memory of Julian's fleeting vulnerability playing over and over in her mind. The thought of surrendering to him, of accepting any terms he might offer, was a profound betrayal of everything she stood for. Yet the thought of losing everything, of watching her father's legacy turn to dust, was a pain too great to bear. She was trapped between two impossible choices. It was during this time that she began to truly confront the nature of her own desires. She had always believed love and intimacy should be pure, built on trust and shared history, like the slow, patient process of restoring a book. Julian Thorne was the antithesis of this ideal. He was sudden, destructive, and dangerous. Yet the thought of his touch, of his intense, consuming gaze, sparked a fire in her that she had never known. She started to realize that her carefully constructed world of duty and self-denial had also been a prison, protecting her not only from pain, but also from passion. The desire he awakened in her was terrifying because it promised a life of vibrant, chaotic feeling, a stark contrast to the safe, gray silence she had always known. Julian, meanwhile, was orchestrating his final move. He recognized that simply taking the bookstore would be a hollow victory. He didn't just want her property. He wanted her surrender. He wanted her to concede that his worldview was the correct one, that in the end, everything, even her precious honor, had a price. He began to formulate a plan, a proposition so specific, so personal, that it would force her to confront the very core of her identity. It would not be a simple financial transaction. It would be a test, an exquisitely cruel experiment designed to prove his cynical philosophy once and for all. He needed to see her choose to become a part of his world, to willingly step into his gilded cage. The final summons came not as a legal document, but as a personal message delivered by a courier. A single heavy cream-colored card was inside the envelope, bearing only his initials embossed in gold and an address, his private residence, the penthouse at the top of his tower. Below it, a handwritten note. "Tonight, 9 o'clock, we will settle this." There was no room for negotiation. It was a command. Ilara held the card, its sharp, clean edges feeling like a weapon against her palm. She knew this was the end of the game. He was calling her to his lair, to the heart of his power, to deliver the final killing blow, or perhaps to offer a salvation that would cost more than her home. Standing in the fading light of her bookstore, surrounded by the ghosts of her ancestors and the weight of her responsibilities, Ilara made her choice. It was not a choice born of hope or courage, but of pure, unadulterated desperation. The path of righteous defiance had led her to a dead end. Now there was only one path left, a dark, terrifying road that led directly to him. She would go. She would walk into the lion's den, not knowing if she was going to be devoured or offered a devil's bargain. As she looked at her own reflection in the dark glass of the shop window, a pale, determined ghost, she realized she was no longer just fighting for her past. She was fighting for any kind of future at all, even one forged in a compromise that might shatter her soul. The elevator ascended in unnerving silence, a glass box climbing the spine of the tower, carrying Ilara away from the solid ground of her own world and into the stratosphere of his. Each floor it passed was a layer of her old self being stripped away. When the doors opened directly into his penthouse, the transgression felt absolute and irreversible. The space was a testament to a brutal kind of beauty, vast, minimalist, and cold, with windows that replaced walls, showcasing the city below as a glittering, conquered territory. The air was cool and smelled of nothing but clean, sterile wealth. She stood on the threshold, a worn woolen coat her only armor, feeling like a ghost from a forgotten century who had wandered into a future she could not comprehend. This was not a home. It was a monument to a man who had successfully amputated his own heart, and she had just willingly stepped inside its empty cavity. He was waiting for her, not with a greeting, but with a drink in his hand, a dark amber liquid in a crystal glass. He gestured towards the cityscape with it, a king surveying his domain. "This is what people fight for," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the polished floor. "Power. The ability to erase what came before and build what you want." He turned to face her, his eyes holding no warmth, only a clinical intensity. "You fight for the past. It's an admirable, but ultimately futile, position." He then laid out his proposition, his words precise and devoid of emotion. He spoke of a charity gala, a crucial business deal, and the need for a companion who projected an authenticity he could not manufacture. He wasn't offering her a loan or a partnership. He was offering her a role. He wanted to rent her soul for an evening, to wear her integrity like an accessory. The offer hung in the air between them, obscene in its simplicity. Just one night, he had said, the words echoing the title of a sordid novel. He would save her world, her father's legacy, everything she had bled for, and in return she had to become a beautiful lie for him. It was a devil's bargain of the highest order, a transaction designed to prove his most cherished belief, that everything, even her fierce, incorruptible spirit, had a price tag. Ilara felt a wave of nausea. This was a violation far deeper than the demolition of her store. He wanted to own her story, to script her reality for a night, and in doing so make her a collaborator in her own spiritual destruction. The choice was a razor's edge. Preserve the physical shell of her history by sacrificing its very soul, or maintain her integrity while watching everything she loved burn to the ground. In the end, it was the image of her father's frail, defeated form that made the decision for her. A hollow yes escaped her lips, a sound so small it was almost swallowed by the vastness of the room. The moment the word was spoken, a strange calm descended upon her, the eerie peace that follows the acceptance of the inevitable. The hours that followed were a blur of surreal activity. A team of people, summoned by a single, silent text from Julian, descended upon her. She was plucked, polished and sculpted. A gown of midnight blue silk, cool and heavy against her skin, replaced her simple dress. Jewels, cold and brilliant, were clasped around her neck and wrists, feeling less like adornments and more like beautiful glittering manacles. When she finally looked in the mirror, she did not recognize the woman staring back. It was a stranger, elegant and impossibly sad, her eyes holding the terrified look of a captured animal. The gala was a glittering inferno of superficiality. Laughter that never reached the eyes, conversations that were intricate power plays disguised as pleasantries, and the constant, blinding flash of cameras. Ilara moved through it all on Julian's arm, a perfect automaton. She smiled when he prompted, spoke when it was required, her voice a soft, cultured murmur she didn't recognize as her own. She was a masterpiece of his creation, and he displayed her with a subtle, possessive pride. He watched the way other men looked at her, the genuine admiration she inspired, and a flicker of something dark and triumphant crossed his face. For Ilara, the experience was profoundly dissociative. She felt as if she were floating above her own body, watching a film of a life that wasn't hers. Each sip of champagne was a toast to her own damnation, each polite smile a crack forming in her soul. He led her to a secluded terrace, away from the suffocating heat and noise of the ballroom. The night air was sharp and cold, a welcome shock to her senses. Below them, the city lights were a river of diamonds. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the pretense of their arrangement momentarily suspended by the vast, impersonal beauty of the night. "They call me the architect of ruin, you know," he said suddenly, his voice low, directed at the city rather than at her. "It's because I grew up in a place that was already ruined, a place where the only beautiful things were the ones you could take, not build." It was a confession so stark, so unexpected, that it pierced through the fog of her dissociation. He had revealed a single, jagged shard of his past, a glimpse of the wounded boy who had learned to survive by becoming a destroyer. His vulnerability was a disarming weapon, far more potent than his power had ever been. She turned to look at him, truly seeing the man beside the monster for the first time. The hard lines of his face were softened in the moonlight, and the storm in his eyes had momentarily calmed, replaced by a profound, ancient weariness. "Perhaps," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant city hum, "you just never had anyone show you how to restore things instead." The words were not meant as a rebuke or a judgment, but as a simple, sad observation. They hung in the air between them, an offering of empathy he had not known how to ask for. He looked down at her, his composure finally, irrevocably shattering, and she saw in his gaze a raw, desperate hunger that mirrored the secret ache in her own heart. The kiss was not a gentle exploration. It was a collision. It was the desperate, violent meeting of two worlds that had been destined to annihilate each other. His hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair with a possessiveness that was both terrifying and thrilling. His mouth was hard and demanding against hers, a desperate attempt to devour the loneliness, to taste the authenticity he had tried to buy. And Ilara, to her own profound shock, met his hunger with her own. She kissed him back with all the repressed longing of a lifetime, all the silent, secret desires she had only ever read about in books. It was an act of total, reckless surrender, a transgression far greater than their sordid business deal. It was a confession, a plea, and a damnation, all in a single, breathless moment. When they finally broke apart, they were both gasping for air, the world around them tilting on its axis. The carefully constructed walls between them had been leveled, leaving them exposed and raw in the ruins. The deal was a ghost, a pathetic, meaningless contract in the face of the overwhelming emotional truth that now bound them. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a mixture of shock, desire, and something that looked terrifyingly like fear. He had wanted to own her, to prove she could be bought, but in a single, unplanned kiss, he had revealed that he was the one who was truly bankrupt. He had shown her the one thing he owned that was truly priceless, his pain, and she had not run from it. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted, leaving them not as master and pawn, but as two equals on the brink of a beautiful, terrible abyss. Without a word, he took her hand. His touch was no longer part of a performance. It was a claim. He led her away from the terrace, not back to the glittering lies of the gala, but through a series of quiet, private corridors. Ilara followed, her heart hammering against her ribs, her mind a whirlwind of terror and exhilaration. Every step she took was a step away from the girl she had been, the dutiful keeper of a dusty, silent world. She was walking into the heart of the storm, willingly, with a man who had promised to destroy her and had instead shown her a reflection of her own brokenness. She knew, with a certainty that was both a liberation and a death sentence, that this night would not end with the fulfillment of a contract. It would end with the complete and utter annihilation of the life she had known, and she was no longer certain she wanted to be saved. The pale, merciless light of dawn found Ilara standing outside the bookstore, the key trembling in her hand. She was still wearing the midnight blue gown, now a wrinkled, shameful relic of the night before, hidden beneath her own simple wool coat. The transition from the sterile, silent opulence of his penthouse to the familiar, worn cobblestones of her own street was a violent sensory whiplash. The air here smelled of damp earth, old brick, and the faint, sweet promise of bread from the bakery, a scent of life that felt like an accusation. She had left her world a desperate girl, willing to make a sacrifice, and returned as a woman who had committed a transgression, a ghost haunting the threshold of her own home, no longer certain she had the right to enter. The bookstore, her sanctuary, now looked like the scene of a crime she had yet to fully comprehend. A sterile email notification with the subject line "Transaction Complete" was the first thing she saw when she opened her laptop. The numbers that appeared on the screen, a sum large enough to erase a century of struggle, offered no relief, no triumph. They felt like blood money, a cold, digital brand marking her soul. The silence of the store, once a comforting embrace, was now heavy with judgment. Every book seemed to watch her, their leather-bound spines like a silent jury. She had saved their physical forms, but she felt as though she had betrayed the very essence of the stories they held. Tales of honor, of patient love, of integrity held above all else. She had sold a piece of her own narrative to preserve theirs, and the exchange had left her feeling hollowed out, a beautifully restored but empty binding. In his glass tower, Julian Thorne watched the same sun rise, its brilliant rays doing nothing to warm the cold expanse of his living room. He had won. The deal was secured, his reputation solidified, and the small, sentimental problem of Vance & Sons booksellers had been efficiently resolved. Yet, the victory tasted like ash in his mouth. He was alone, surrounded by a fortune that could purchase anything but the one thing he had unexpectedly encountered the night before, a genuine human connection that was not a transaction. The memory of her kiss, of the startling, unguarded empathy in her eyes when she spoke of restoration, was a virus in his carefully controlled system. He had set out to prove that everything had a price, only to discover a profound, aching poverty within himself that no amount of money could cure. Facing her father later that morning was the cruelest part of her penance. She presented the news of their salvation as a miracle, a story of a benevolent foundation that had recognized the cultural value of the store. The lie was a bitter acid on her tongue. Arthur Vance, his eyes filling with a clarity she hadn't seen in months, reached for her hand, his frail fingers gripping hers with renewed strength. His relief, the pure, unadulterated joy on his face, was a physical blow to her conscience. She had saved him from despair by plunging herself into a new, secret one. She was his devoted daughter, his noble protector, and it was all built on a foundation of the most profound shame. Every grateful look he gave her was another stone laid upon her chest, threatening to crush her. Julian, too, found his routine fractured beyond repair. He strode into his office, issuing commands with his usual ruthless efficiency, but his mind was not on the billion-dollar mergers or the architectural blueprints. It was in a dusty, quiet bookstore, replaying a conversation on a moonlit terrace. Her words, "You just never had anyone show you how to restore things," echoed in the sterile silence of his world, a quiet accusation that dismantled the very architecture of his identity. He was the architect of ruin, a title he had worn with pride, but for the first time it felt less like a testament to his power and more like a diagnosis of a terminal illness. He found himself staring at the plans for his next glass tower and seeing not a monument to progress, but a tombstone. In the quiet solitude of her workshop, Alara began the painstaking process of removing the remnants of the night before. She took off the borrowed jewels, their cold weight, a phantom sensation on her skin long after they were gone. As she washed her face, scrubbing away the expertly applied makeup, she stared at her reflection. The woman in the mirror was different. The fear and innocence that had once defined her features were still there, but now they were overlaid with a new, complex shadow of experience. Something had broken inside her, yes, but in the cracks a strange and unfamiliar strength was taking root. She had walked into the heart of her greatest fear and had not been consumed. The shame was a fire, but she was beginning to realize that she was not made of paper after all. The separation was absolute and immediate. There was no follow-up call, no polite inquiry. The transaction was complete, the contract fulfilled. Julian sat in his office, the chrome and leather reflecting his own impassive mask, and fought the inexplicable urge to pick up the phone. The impulse was a foreign, unwelcome intruder in the fortress of his self-control. What would he even say? His vocabulary was one of acquisition, of leverage and negotiation. He possessed no words for the disquieting tenderness he had felt, for the terrifying vulnerability she had exposed in him. To contact her now would be to admit a need, a weakness he had spent his entire life eradicating. And so, he chose silence, the familiar, cold comfort of his self-imposed exile, even as it began to feel more like a prison than ever before. Alara returned to her work, her hands moving with a newfound, deliberate focus over the fragile pages of a decaying manuscript. Her world was safe, the threat extinguished. The rhythm of her life should have returned to its peaceful, predictable cadence, but the silence was now different. It was no longer a space of quiet contemplation, but a vast, empty canvas filled with the memory of him, his voice, the intensity of his gaze, the shocking, desperate heat of his kiss. She had spent her life surrounded by the ghosts of the past, but now she was haunted by the living presence of a man she was supposed to despise. The fear of losing her home had been replaced by a new, more terrifying fear, that she had tasted a life of vibrant, dangerous feeling, and the quiet safety of her old world would never be enough again. They existed now as two poles of a single, shared secret, separated by the vast social and emotional chasm that had always been between them. He, in his tower, looked down upon a city he owned but could no longer find satisfaction in. She, in her bookstore, was surrounded by the legacy she had saved, yet felt a profound sense of personal loss. He had meant to demolish her world and had instead cracked the foundation of his own. She had meant to save her history and had instead irrevocably altered her future. They were two solitary figures, suffering in the quiet aftermath of a collision that had left them both wounded, both changed, and both utterly, devastatingly alone with the consequences of a single, transformative night. The bookstore was secure, its future guaranteed by a devil's bargain. The scent of old paper and leather was the same, the amber light still filtered through the dusty windows, but the peace Alara had fought so hard to preserve was gone forever. It had been replaced by a restless, aching awareness, a longing for the very man who represented her ruin and, she was terrified to admit, her awakening. She had won the war for her family's legacy, but in the silent, echoing chambers of her own heart, she had started a new and far more dangerous conflict. The deal was done, but she understood with a chilling certainty that the true cost of that one night was still waiting to be paid, and it would be a debt she would carry for the rest of her life. 6 months passed, turning the crisp Boston autumn into a deep, resilient winter. The bell above the door of Vance & Sons booksellers now chimed with a gentle, steady frequency, announcing the arrival of students, collectors, and curious tourists. Alara had used Julian's money not just to erase the debt, but to breathe life back into the store's tired lungs. The shelves were polished, the lighting was warm and inviting, and a new section dedicated to local poets was thriving. Her father, buoyed by their renewed fortune, had regained some of his old light, his voice a soft murmur as he once again shared stories with patrons. Ilara moved through this restored world with a new, quiet confidence, her hands steady, her heart waiting. She had saved her past, but the memory of one night, of a man made of ruin and revelation, had left her future feeling like a beautiful, unfinished manuscript. One morning, as the city was still wrapped in a soft gray haze, she arrived to find a package resting against the freshly painted front door. It was wrapped in simple brown paper and tied with twine, an object of humble, deliberate care that stood in stark contrast to the sterile, corporate envelopes that had once plagued her life. There was no shipping label, no return address. It had been left here, personally, a silent offering on her doorstep. Her heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs, a rhythm of recognition she hadn't felt since she'd last stood on a moonlit terrace. A premonition, sharp and certain, told her this was not a delivery from the world she had rebuilt, but a message from the one she had tried, and failed, to leave behind. She carried it inside, the package feeling impossibly heavy in her arms. She placed it on her workbench, the same surface where she had laid out his final notice all those months ago. Her fingers, now sure and practiced, untied the twine and carefully unfolded the paper. Inside lay a book. It was a first edition of Whitman's Leaves of Grass, a volume so rare in its original binding that it was considered a ghost in the literary world. And it was in terrible condition. The cover was scarred, the spine was completely broken, and the pages were foxed with age and neglect. It was a magnificent ruin, a masterpiece on the verge of turning to dust. It was a perfect, heartbreaking metaphor for the man who had sent it. She ran a reverent, trembling hand over the damaged cover, feeling not the decay of the object, but the soul of the sender, laid bare and vulnerable for her inspection. Tucked just inside the cover was a single, heavy card of familiar cream-colored stock. There was no embossed initial, only a few lines of elegant, controlled script that she would have recognized anywhere. The note was not an apology, nor was it a demand. It was something far more profound. It read, "I was told you are the best at restoring things that others have deemed beyond saving. I find myself in possession of such an item." It was unsigned, but it was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. He was not offering her a transaction. He was asking for a miracle. He was admitting that his world of demolition had reached its limit, and that he was, himself, a thing in need of mending. The cold, powerful magnet had finally confessed that he was, in fact, the ruin. The carefully constructed dam within her broke. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, not of sorrow, but of a deep, aching recognition. This was his true surrender, an act of trust so profound it eclipsed everything that had come before. He had sent her his own brokenness, his own scarred and damaged history, and placed it in her hands. He was asking if she, the keeper of lost stories, could find a way to restore his. It was a question that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with grace. Holding the ruined book to her chest, she felt the last of her anger and shame dissolve, replaced by a wave of overwhelming, terrifying tenderness. A sudden, inexplicable instinct made her lift her head and look out the large front window, her gaze searching the quiet morning street. Through the old, wavy glass of the storefront, she caught a fleeting glimpse of a sleek black car as it turned the corner at the far end of the block, its form disappearing into the city's awakening pulse. He had been there. He had delivered his confession and then retreated, leaving the next move, the next word, the next chapter entirely up to her. He had given her back her power. A slow, tentative smile, the first genuine one she'd felt in months, touched Ilara's lips. The bookstore was safe, her father was healing, and a man who believed only in ruin was asking to be rebuilt. The story was not over, it was just beginning. If you believe in the power of second chances, and wish to see what new chapter Ilara decides to write, I invite you to subscribe, like, and share this story. Please let us know in the comments what you hope happens next.